Welcome to this high-level event on UN development system reform, co-hosted by the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Nigeria. My name is Hugh Dugan, professor at the School of Diplomacy of Seton Hall University, and previously member of the U.S. delegation to the UN, where I advised 11 permanent representatives for over 26 years. It is an honor to serve today as your moderator. We are honored to welcome so many distinguished participants, too many to identify in our brief time together. At times like this, I never go wrong by addressing everyone as Your Excellency. This event brings together a cross-regional group of member states to discuss the recommendations of the Secretary General's June 2017 report, Repositioning the UN Development System to Deliver on the 2030 Agenda, Ensuring a Better Future for All. In the report, the Secretary General reviews the functions and capacities of the UN development system and sets out his vision for how the system must adapt to support countries to deliver Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. We are at a critical juncture. The Secretary General's report is just the start of an ambitious reform process throughout the organization, including a universal development agenda. A further report will be issued in December 2017 with a comprehensive set of recommendations. Our discussion today will provide useful views for that report. Indeed, this event provides an opportunity for member states to signal their support for the Secretary General's vision, discuss how they make UN development system reform a reality, and consider how it can be put into practice in their own countries. Peace and prosperity are what propelled the adoption of the UN Charter 72 years ago. The UN system's two main pillars, promoting peace and promoting development, are placed on an unequal footing, however. While the Security Council may enforce its decisions involving peace and security, promoting development cannot be enforced. So delivery of UN development activities is voluntary. Naturally, this affects obtaining the necessary resources and the ways those resources are to be used. Trust of the UN development system by member states and donors, therefore, becomes the sine qua non for that system. Beyond being convinced that its tasks are worthwhile, member states must have confidence that the system is both effective and efficient. Effective means doing the right thing, and efficient means doing the thing right. Today's discussion will look at repositioning the UN development system to these ends. Repositioning, as a term being used here, is not something done by an artist staging a still life to paint. No, repositioning is a gyroscope constantly striving for balance and motion. Repositioning is a world managing monster hurricanes, surprise nuclear tests, and terrorist flare-ups, all without the luxury of rehearsal. Repositioning is a real-time, 24/7 duty and chore, not a once-in-a-while tune-up when there is time, or a dalliance for social scientists to tinker into some wordy solution. The UN development goals and its system require member states' continuous political attention and technical stewardship. Indeed, UN reform is, in the words of Kofi Annan, an ongoing process, and now one which moves beyond the MDGs to the SDGs. In the words of Secretary General Guterres, beyond business as usual. But clearly there is no app for this. We are not here this morning to design a self-driving car for taking us from 1945 to future prosperity. Nor must our time here attempt to offload the UN reform chore onto the Secretariat or later scapegoat it with political fallout. Indeed, we convene here this week as the United Nations, not the United Secretariat. Results throughout the UN development system depend upon the United Nations. Member states, all having bought bonds long on global prosperity, supported by a United Secretariat, not the other way around. Indeed, member states must provide policy, resources, and cooperation. Representing a good sampling of those member states, we turn to today's expert co-hosts and panelists. In their distinguished careers, they have offered themselves accountable to both political forces at home and to the principles of the UN Charter. For this, we owe them our gratitude and our close attention. I will now turn the floor over to the co-host. Excuse me. But first, I would like to tell speakers and participants how to use the intercom system. Please when you wish to speak, please press the button on the left of the unit to turn on the microphone. Underneath the microphone, a button below. And when the booth recognizes us, your microphone will become active. I would invite now the Secretary of State for International Development of the United Kingdom to take the floor, the Honorable Priti Patel.
Thank you very much, and Excellencies, friends and colleagues. I welcome you all to this discussion on how we will enable the United Nations system to meet the needs and challenges that we face across our very difficult globe, but also the international system that we're all part of. But first of all, I would just like to pay tribute and thank my co-hosts for their leadership as well, my colleague from Mexico and my colleague from Nigeria too, for joining us and joining the United Kingdom in very much leading a collaborative approach to this vital and essential agenda. Britain has always been bold and confident in the way in which we stand up for what we believe in, and this applies equally to the work that we do on development and much of the leadership that we give on international development around the world. Whether it's tackling modern scourges such as killer diseases, modern-day slavery, oppression of women and girls, we know that we will stand up to do the right thing, and we will work collaboratively with all our colleagues, and in particularly within the United Nations system, to achieve better outcomes for those who need help and support. We have led the way in responding to urgent crises, and we are a proud and proactive member of the multilateral system. With the crisis that the system is now facing, we know, though, as one of the largest core funders to the development and humanitarian agencies, that obviously there's more that has to be done. And the UN's universal membership, of course, is a place where states strengthen alliances and build new relationships and work with the 192 potential partners. And it is because of our commitment that we are working hard to improve performance, but also generate reforms within the system itself. Now, we all know the modern challenges that we face: disease, famines, persecution, terrorism, instability, all of which are leaving millions of our fellow citizens around the world without hope or aspiration. The endless potential of millions of fellow citizens whose human capital has been degraded and who are held back in countries by governments and organisations who are simply not creating the conditions of opportunity and growth puts a greater strain on the development system. And as a result, that is really part of the challenge that we are facing. From the current crises across the Middle East, Africa, Burma, to the conflicts, droughts and famines, environmental disasters that we have witnessed just in the last 10 days, from Hurricane Irma to Hurricane Maria. These have shown that the international system is struggling to cope. And while the objectives and the goals of the UN are timeless, the structures and the systems we have today are designed for different eras and have not adapted to the realities of today. And the challenges of fragile states, terrorism, extremism, cross-border conflict and a changing climate are now challenging the system. And as the Secretary General has highlighted, have shown the weakness in that international system. But on top of that, we have also seen that over the last 70 years, the UN has ballooned in terms of a multiplicity of agencies and organisations which spend billions in funds, programmes, costs, overheads, but there is simply not enough coherence across that landscape when it comes to sharing resources and also in securing the effectiveness of aid. And the levels of inefficiency are shocking, with competition between agencies and bodies generating institutional turf wars that hinder and harm the very efforts that we are meant to assist. Examples such as money wasted, inefficient and counterproductive use of aid are simply just the tip of the iceberg. On top of that, and I pay credit to the Secretary-General who himself has raised this issue this week as well, we have seen the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse being carried out under the UN flag, not just by peacekeepers but across agencies. And these deplorable crimes are being committed against children and vulnerable people, the very people that the United Nations and the system is mandated to protect. And as a world leader in development, the United Kingdom will be at the forefront of assisting and working with the United Nations to wipe out this scourge. And inaction is not an option at all. And we believe that certainly through our global leadership, but working collaboratively with all colleagues, that we can be at the forefront of driving the fundamental reform that we wish to see across the system. So there are several key themes that have come out of the UN Secretary-General's first report on system reform, building the strong foundations for the UN for the 21st century. And of course, one of that is based on efficiency and transparency and the ability to justify how we spend our taxpayer funds and, importantly, what outcomes we are driving. Now, of course, the UN must embrace efficiency, but this isn't about doing less, it's about doing more, and it's about reaching more people with the resources that we have by collaborating, pooling resources, but also by bringing together the best practice and tackling waste. Accountability is a central theme as well. Wanting our system to be more accountable is something that we all believe in, but finding the right mechanisms to generate that greater transparency. But also, we want to see staff through this complicated system being held to account for their performance and their conduct, and ultimately improving performance on the ground. And so these reforms have such an impact and will have a fundamental impact, yes, on the system, but importantly will strengthen the development impact of the outcomes that we all wish to see. Now, for our part, the United Kingdom is fully committed to working with you all and with the Secretary-General on building a better UN for the 21st century. And we are setting down some very clear markers in terms of how we will mark that change. From next year, almost a third of our core funding to UN development and humanitarian agencies will be dependent upon improved results and progress on reform priorities. For all major emergencies, agencies will have to demonstrate the effective accountability and feedback mechanisms that they have in place if they want to secure that funding from British taxpayers. And we are demanding more effective and efficient delivery of assistance to vulnerable people, including the greater use of cash transfers. Cash, rather than flying in and out food and supplies, is a much more efficient way of enabling that people can make their own choices and access support. But also, we are about development, and this is a crucial mechanism to help build local markets, creating jobs and economic growth, rather than perpetuating the aid dependency that we have seen across too many communities for far too long. No country, ladies and gentlemen, can defeat poverty and leave aid dependency behind without sustainable economic jobs and growth. And we know that trade and investment, free markets and economic growth can be and are the route out of poverty. But UK aid seeks to raise the horizons and transform people's lives and secure better futures. And that is why we believe in investing more in these systems, but also calling upon the UN and colleagues to work more closely with the private sector to support that engine of job creation too. I've already mentioned the issue of sexual abuse and exploitation, and the United Kingdom's position could not be any clearer. We want the UN to have the best-in-class systems for training, prevention, detection in order to protect the world's vulnerable. We want the UN system to make sure that they enhance their investigation and prosecution capability. We want legal immunity of whatever form to make sure that it does not exist or can be claimed for child sex crimes. But also, we need to see greater accountability and action on these issues. And of course, working with the Secretary General, we will drive those reforms forward. This is an urgent agenda, and of course no one in this room can be in any doubt about the urgency of reform of this incredible institution and system. But on behalf of British taxpayers, the UK government will absolutely stand up for what we believe in. Reform priorities are our priorities, and I will call on colleagues and others to do the same, because we know that the UN's goals and objectives are timeless, but also a UN that embraces reform can release its enormous potential and build it up to make it one of the most relevant and functional institutions of the 21st century. And we simply, ladies and gentlemen, cannot allow the institutions themselves to slide into irrelevance at a time when we are confronted by endless disasters. If we look at the state of the world today, no one can doubt that we are simply not able to meet the level of need based on disasters, conflict, instability, and the fact that so many people are subject to endemic poverty. A global Britain will lead this challenge, but importantly, we will work with everyone that will support this agenda and be much more engaged so that we can take forward an outward-looking international system. Our work is to serve and serve those whose futures are dependent upon the very actions that we undertake today. I thank you for your support.
Thank you very much, Secretary, for those opening remarks. And now we would like to pass the floor to another co-host, the Mexican Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights, His Excellency Miguel Ruiz Cabañas.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to be here to participate in this panel in the company of the Secretary of State of the United Kingdom and the Ambassador Permanent Representative of Nigeria. The first time I came to the United Nations, it was a long time ago. It was in 1979, and I had to follow closely the debate on the international development at that time, and I remember it was a very, very ideological debate. There was a huge divide among countries from the northern reach and the southern part of the world that was less developed. I think that the United Nations had, since then, a lot of progress. Less ideology, more concrete objectives for promoting development, both within countries and to try to reduce the international divide among the northern rich part of the world and the southern poorer part of the world. In this context, Mexico recognizes the approach taken and the achievements made by the Secretary General, Antonio Gutierrez, regarding its policy of integration, coherence, coordination, transparency, accountability, and functioning within the United Nations development system. Aligning the work of the agencies with the mandate of the resolution, and I quote, quadriennial comprehensive policy review of operational activities for development of the United Nations system, unquote, adopted in the last General Assembly has been essential. Let me say something about the functions and capacities needed to deliver on the 2030 Sustainable Agenda. The level of ambition of the agenda poses significant challenges for countries, but also to civil society, the private sector, international organizations, and the UN system itself. The integrality of the agenda is the most important issue to address. It calls for leaving behind sectoral efforts in sustainable development in order to adopt a coordinated multidisciplinary approach, given the link between the SDGs and their targets. Disaggregated data is essential for issuing diagnosis and generating public policies in order to accurately assess the impacts of international and government policies concerning the goals of the agenda. In this sense, it has to be stressed that around 50% of the funds are being concentrated in only 3 of the SDGs, the SDG number 2, 3, and 16. In the long term, this situation may hamper or diminish the achievements of other SDGs. We believe that an effective, coherent, and well-coordinated work among agencies, funds, programs, and various offices contributes to the full implementation of the agenda. The United Nations Development System must strengthen coordination among agencies in order to avoid duplicities and to foster synergies at the national, regional, and global levels. This will increase the impact and efficiency of the United Nations Development System actions at each level. It is imperative to recognize, in this regard, the role of the South-South cooperation as a means for implementing the SDGs and allow the exchange of experience, technologies, and resources to ensure inclusive and sustainable development. Bear in mind that it complements but not substitutes the North-South cooperation. Regarding the proposal to provide country teams with a modular structure, Mexico agrees that, given the current challenges, the United Nations Development System cannot function in similar manner in all contexts or countries. Concerning the review of the optimal structure of country teams within the framework of the United Nations Development and System Fund, Mexico's experience in the negotiation and definition of the fund indicates that these documents are rarely perfect and it is necessary to work on some unforeseen areas. The proposal to reduce physical presence in countries could limit the ability of the system for adapting the changing realities on the ground and turning the United Nations Development System into the master document, which could put excessive pressure on governments at the time of the negotiation, and if it does not count with enough flexibility. Moreover, if the presence of the United Nations Development System entities is reduced in countries such as Mexico and other middle-income countries in Latin America, the capacity of national counterparts to work with them will be hampered as well. We must not forget that due to inequality, the majority of poor people still lives in middle-income countries such as Mexico or other Latin American countries. If our collective goal is to reduce poverty across the globe, we should include mix in our UN strategies. Regarding resident coordinators, let me say a few comments. One, the strengthening of this figure is considered positive, in particular the achievement of the gender parity in the number of coordinators. Two, however, the proposal seems to disassociate the country representatives from the United Nations Development Program by establishing a primus inter pares figure whose choice will be centered on capacity criteria and on the rotation between agencies or among agencies, regions, and gender. While the idea of rotating country representatives' positions may seem attractive, it must be recalled that it has already been criticized on a number of occasions, particularly by agencies that feel that the United Nations Development Program tends to exaggerate its dominant position to promote their own agenda. In order to prevent this, Mexico supports the creation of a body of resident coordinators, which will directly be dependent on the SDGs, promoting the specialization. For Mexico, the SDGs require better management, alliances, and funding to fulfill the agenda promise of ensuring that no one is left behind. We need, therefore, to be more ambitious. Encouraging the strengthening of ECOSOC and its subsidiary bodies and functional commissions will help improve the governance architecture of the United Nations Development System by improving strategic planning, implementation of objectives, reporting, and system-wide evaluation regarding the implementation of the SDGs. Highlighting and emphasizing the role of ECOSOC's operational activities segment as a key element for the implementation and monitoring of the resolution, quote, quadriennial comprehensive policy review of operational activities for development of the United Nations system, unquote, will provide the United Nations Development System the necessary tools for the implementation and follow-up of the agenda. Coordination between the General Assembly and ECOSOC should strengthen to promote social progress and raise the standards of living with a broader concept of sustainable development. In conclusion, despite the concrete points and comments I made on specific proposals presented by the Secretary General, Mexico would like to remain as a reliable partner for the United Nations Development System, and especially on the initiative taken by the Secretary General on its reform of the whole system. We will support the Secretary General's efforts in this regard, as well as any other area that needs to be reformed. Mexico yesterday participated in the meeting organized by the government of the United States and the Secretary General. We have signed the Declaration for UN Reform. We link that declaration with the Secretary General report proposing so many ideas and concrete proposals for reforming this area. I thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary. I now give the floor to our third co-host, the Nigerian Undersecretary responsible for regions and international organizations at the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Ifeoma Akabogu Chinwuba.
Thank you. Excellencies, let me start by commending the United Kingdom and Mexico for collaborating with us in organizing this important high-level event on the United Nations Development System reform. Nigeria believes that the current global development landscape requires a UN development system that is devoid of silos operating mechanism. We believe that assistance operating country by country and issue by issue with priorities heavily driven by individual donors and their interests is no longer fit for its intended purpose. Following the adoption of the ambitious 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it is apparent that the structure of the UN development system must develop mechanisms to fully respond to the inextricable linkages across countries and among the three dimensions of sustainable development, which are social, economic, and environmental. We believe that this structured initiative should assist the efforts aimed at addressing the high demands of the new commitments for transforming the course of development and ensure equitable, sustainable, and a firm alignment with the ethos of human rights. Nigeria believes that poorly coordinated programs undermine national efforts aimed at achieving a coherent policy framework for development. In addition, they fall short in addressing critical systemic challenges, namely inequality, financial contagion, and climate change. To ensure compliance with the 2030 Agenda, Nigeria believes that the structure of the UN development system should fit into the current incremental approach. We also believe that in order to make the UN development system coalesce into the 2030 agenda, there must be genuine commitment to multilateralism. One which works to guarantee a sustainable and safer world that serves the interests of every country and person. In this regard, the UN development system needs to operate within a system-wide framework, one that relies heavily on integrated institutions and impact assessments. Furthermore, it must support a more coherent approach to governance and a member state commitment to consistent financing, including through assessed contributions. In addition, we believe that any system-wide framework must be grounded in the primary purpose of the UN development system, which is to support the realization of internationally agreed standards on human rights, sustainable development, and peaceful as well as just societies. Nigeria stresses the need for increased UN political leadership to address sources of UN dysfunction. In this regard, we urge the Secretary General to take the lead on a number of measures that could potentially unlock transformation, including through providing options to improve governance, conduct a system-wide mapping to identify gaps and overlaps as a basis for strategic recommendations. To address these, prepare a system-wide strategic document translating the recommendations into actions, and to develop a comprehensive proposal to further improve the resident coordinator system. Furthermore, we believe that there is a need to establish strategic governance under the collective review of UN member states. Undertaking this step, in our views, would lead to effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, and responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. In addition, the delegation of Nigeria wishes to stress the need for more coherent global management of the UN development system. While the UN resident coordinator system has been an attempt to institute more coordinated management of the UN development system in individual countries, it would appear that no parallel function exists at the headquarters level. Nigeria also underscores the need for the establishment of an independent and impartial internal oversight capacity, possibly through collaboration between the Office of Legal Affairs and the Office of Internal Oversight. This would help ensure that such oversight takes place consistently and with the same standards across the UN development system as a whole, rather than primarily within individual agencies. It should aim at the integrity of UN operations and the substantive outcomes of its support, such as through the prevention of partnerships, appointments, or practices that contradict the objectives of the 2030 agenda. Nigeria believes that increasing demands on the UN development system from the 2030 agenda also require a review of the role of the resident coordinator. In conclusion, we should like to emphasize that organizations must also operate under the system-wide framework according to development needs, a situation where such entities operate on a project-by-project basis, thereby encouraging fragmentation and shifting of priorities, must be holistically addressed. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary. Now we've heard from our three co-hosts, and it's the opportunity for our panelists to come forward and present their thoughts in a more spontaneous fashion over the questions that we've asked you to consider in the course of this morning's program. And so it gives me great pleasure to provide the floor to each panelist for 3 to 4 minutes or so that we can engage in a lively discussion. And I would like to start by inviting the Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh, His Excellency Mohammed Shahidul Haq, to speak with his thoughts on the following question that I'll put.
Thank you very much, distinguished chair. Thanks to the co-hosts for inviting Bangladesh to speak. And I tend to agree that the world that we are currently living in many ways different, and the tomorrow's world will be radically different. Now the question is whether in this radically different world, the UN system, which was designed and developed rather quite long time back, would continue to remain relevant. I'm not even asking about functional. Let me just, before I have 5 points, but before I go into that, let me share with you, and some of you know that, and I just want to sort of refresh our memory, that the way we are currently transacting financial transactions taking place, possibly in 10, 15 years, it will no longer be there. It will be replaced by a different way of transaction, keeping the wealth, transacting it, and valuing it. So under that circumstances, how some of the international financial systems that were developed would function. We are currently struggling with humanitarian issues. Now, one of the questions that often comes up is the system that was developed after the Second World War to take care of the humanitarian issue, in particular the population movements. I come from that particular world, is no longer relevant. It's absolutely failing in helping the state to comprehensively address population movement. And there's a huge complexity in sensitivities, and UN system is not able to answer that complexities and sensitivities. So it's already facing difficulties. Third, the Agenda 2030 that we designed, and it's about a year back, when we go back at the country level and try and implement it, we see there are a lot of gaps. There's a lot of things left hanging. And when we go and implement it, then comes the whole issue of filling in the gaps. And in terms of filling in the gaps, then you sometimes feel like that possibly we have to revisit some of the goals, some of the targets that we all agreed under special circumstances. So in order to UN to support that very complex undertaking of the state, I don't think the present system would be able to serve properly. And I'm extremely happy that Secretary General has opened up discussions, very timely, very open, and very flexible in terms of creating a new UN development system. If there are questions, I'll be very happy to answer. Now, let me share 5 points. First is that it's true that we have already embarked at the country level to implement a very universal and ambitious transformative 2030 agenda. But we also realize that this undertaking is vast. When we were negotiating it, we didn't realize that how much we have committed ourselves to, especially for the developing and LDC countries, not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of the government's engagement in the whole process. And in that process, we realized that UN is still struggling as to where and how it would come and help the government. Even those surface is not clear enough. It's also very expensive. We are not talking about anymore in billions, we are talking about in trillions. So the government is also struggling as to how this additional money would be made available in terms of implementing Agenda 2030, including my own. Among the institutions and entities, UN development, which is very UNRC-based system, is also struggling because they are still, as the Honorable Minister have said, that compartmentalized. They don't know where they should give in and where they should take a new role. Some of them are even not sure as to why they should get out of their traditional role to assume a new role. So that need to be defined, redefined, and possibly revisited the rationale of having some of the UN entities and institutions that were developed long time back and possibly no longer relevant. We need to possibly look for new entities. Business is doing it, governments are doing it, so why not UN? Not that we have to live with a traditional structure. The main paradox is between the availability of resources and the requirement of the resources. There is no match. There is no match. We have done a study in Bangladesh, and we realized that literally we have to put in trillions of dollars in terms of making the investment to achieve some of the targets. And we haven't considered all targets. We have rather prioritized targets. And we are not sure as to where from that money would come. We are not looking in terms of aid or others. We are thinking of our own budgetary allocations, and we are continuously struggling with that. And in that process, we realized that UN system could possibly give us intellectual input, could help us prioritizing some of our targets and goals, but it cannot substantially help a government in the absence of a structure, orientation of the staff, and resources. Second, the conflict and humanitarian situation continue to plague the world. The nature of conflict also has gone through changes. It is mixed of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and many other forces and factors. Currently, we are struggling with the arrival of 1 million Rohingyas from Myanmar, and when we are analyzing it, we realize that it is a border issue, it is a security issue, it is a humanitarian issue, and it's a geopolitical issue, because it is forcing us to look at our relationship vis-a-vis some of the major players that are currently playing there. So in the presence of that, how do we get the support that we are supposed to get from UN? Because they are not actually geared towards helping a state which is in such a complex humanitarian and development situation. And we also realized in the process that the Agenda 2030, which was progressing slowly but pretty good, will have to come to a halt because of the humanitarian crisis, at least in 1/3 of the country, because that's where the Rohingyas has taken shelter, and we have to take care of the humanitarian issue and for the time being forget about the development issue. Sorry for taking a little longer time. I'll close soon. Third, implementation of SDG is much more challenging for vulnerable countries, the climate vulnerable countries, than the normal NDGs countries. And I don't think when we were negotiating the SDGs, we have taken on board the climate vulnerability the way we should have. Every time it came up, I remember some of the countries were suggesting, leave it for the Paris conference to take care of it. But when you take it to the country level, you see that only Paris agreement cannot address all the vulnerability issues. And vulnerability would the make and break for some of the countries. We have seen after a long negotiation, QCPR resolution has been adopted. Although in the QCPR resolution, some of the targets got a higher attention than the rest. Now, when we were negotiating it, the understanding was that these SDGs will be universal, with equal importance. There could be some weightage, additional weightage attached, depending on the country situation, but not at the global level. But now we see that in the QCPR, some of the stronger UN agencies have been able to get a bigger responsibility, because that will bring in more resources for them, and the rather weaker agencies has been left out. They couldn't possibly fought properly. The fifth and the last one is the, do we really need a stronger UN development system? Yes, there's no doubt about that. Now, where that strong structure and the function will come from, that's the questions. And how that will be matched with the country priorities. Often we have seen at the country level because of peculiar nature of UN, that often the UN priorities and the country priorities do not match. Sometimes even they terribly lack in understanding of a country. Let me be very frank, someone who has worked in the UN system for quite some time, when I go back and I realize that, that the UN system has also get acclimatized in terms of country priorities. Resident coordinators issue, I will not raise because I have been in the system, so I have a very inside stories of RCs. That itself is a huge issue. I wouldn't call it a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for launching us in our panel discussion. And I am interested in putting the following question to our next panelist, who is the Vice Minister of International Cooperation for the Netherlands. We had a change of agenda, but we are very, very pleased to have Mr. Christian Rebergen here with us today, to whom I pose this question that the report indeed is only halfway done. We are expecting in December the Secretary General's second portion of the report on repositioning. What issues not considered in the report so far should be considered in his follow-up in December? Thank you.
Thank you. And let me start by, let's say, giving the compliments to the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General for the report, because I honestly have to say they have some bold measures in that report, and I think that's a good basis where we could really build upon. I'll say four things on that report, which I think are good, and on some of them should be elaborated, as was your question, what should be in the next report. And the first thing, I think, which is crucial, is that we need more on the fragmentation and duplication of the system in the countries. And I think that's important. Which organization does what. And now often, I mean, when I am in countries and when I speak to my heads of office in countries, they are lobbied by different organizations from the UN for the same cause. And that's something, I mean, I can't explain at home to my taxpayers. And strong leadership is important. And I think the proposals of the report are in the right direction. A stronger resident coordinator, a strong role of the Deputy Secretary General. We all really applaud for that. And well, another thing on duplication is maybe look at the offices. I mean, now we have 1,433 UN offices in 180 countries. I mean, this is not a sustainable business model, and we should look to those organizations. And we also should look at ourselves, because I know also we are not always coherent as donors or within the donor community to really break that circle. Well, the second thing is partnerships. If you look where we've been successful over the last, when we're achieving the Millennium Development Goals, that's really on areas where we work in partnerships. Look at the health sector, where we've been working in global partnerships. We've shown spectacular results. And the Secretary General set out a clear ambition to bring the UN's potential as a convener to full bloom. And we really would support that, and we'll see more concrete measures in this next report, as you were referring to. Third thing is a bit more, let's say, elaboration on the nexus of security, peace, humanitarian development. I mean, we talk a lot about this, but how are we going to actually implement this in the country level? Joint assessments, joint priority setting. I think these worlds are still often too much separated. Finally, if we really want to safeguard UN funding for the future, and I want to echo what Secretary of State said on this and explain to our taxpayers, we need to show the results. And we need to both, let's say, to the people we want to help in developing countries as to our own taxpayers. And so we're really ready to, well, to also adapt our funding, to base it more on achieving results, and as long as we do this together with more donors. So when I say all this, my people in my office, they say, well, we've tried this before. We've tried this many times before. So why is it different? But I'm convinced it is different. I mean, we have different leadership. We have a group of donors. We really want to let's say, talk also with their purse to make sure that what's they want to do. We have a joint agenda within the UN system. So I think change now is possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And turning to our panelists from a recipient region, Lebanon, I'd like to put the following question to Ms. Vera El-Khoury, who is advisor to the Lebanese Ministry of Culture, and inquire which of the Secretary General's recommendations are particularly relevant for your country and your region.
Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for having been invited to this panel. It's an opportunity for me to talk again about these recommendations. I was a member of the panel of the independent team of advisors who was asked when met the first time with ECOSOC to come with bold recommendations. And when we came back a year later with bold recommendations, we were told you were too bold. And most of them were like criticized very drastically during a meeting. So we all left very depressed, actually, because we felt that we have worked for a whole year for nothing. And then a miracle happened. We have a new Secretary General and a new DSG, and I read this report and I went, wow, they're all in there. So the recommendations are all back, including the very bold ones. Some we had to really fight for because there was resistance. I mean, there is resistance for change, both on the side of member states, on the side of the Secretariat. And I think that one that is going to be absolutely crucial is an evaluation of all the system, all the entities, an independent evaluation, because we have for 70 years added layers and layers, and I've been in the system 20 years. I cannot understand what all these entities, all these commissions, all these organs are all about, what they all do, and whether we really still need all of them. So I think one major thing we need is clarity on what is the system and how is the system going to work together. So this clarity is going to be important for my country, my region. My country needs humanitarian with all the refugees, development because it's a country struggling, and peacekeeping. So we have all the aspects of the UN needed in the country. So the field network is the field reform, the number of offices, but the whole story is worse than that, because I know of an office that costs 1.6 million in staff and administration per year and has a budget to implement programs of $3,000. So this is a big issue, this issue of the field, and working together, the team, the country teams, is going to be crucial for my country, making sure that everybody works together. How do you create UN loyalty instead of each one fighting for his own logo, his entity loyalty? This is something, the how you do this is complicated. And then something that also we discussed a lot is the specialized agencies. How do you link these specialized agencies to the system? What is the way to make them feel they're part of the system? Because sometimes we hear one position from the same member state in a specialized agency, we move to somewhere else and we listen to the same member state saying something completely different. So these are big challenges, and the link between humanitarian and development is, of course, a big issue for my country. You cannot do humanitarian without development and wait for a protracted crisis to end to start with development. Of course, this will not work. And we have to make sure, on the other hand, that the humanitarian doesn't suck all the money from development, because this also is a problem. So this is a balance that is implementation something delicate and something we really have to be very careful about. And of course, for us, what is really important is transparency, accountability, efficiency. These three words are the words, you cannot read any UN document in any entity of the UN system without reading these words everywhere. But there are still many instances where you see that they don't exist. And this is, for me, the biggest challenge, because without this, there will be no trust. And without trust, we will not really succeed. And you can't say, I'm here, I'm going to do this, I want trust. It's an era of show me, don't tell me. So we're going to need to show and gain the trust for all this to work. And I would like to say a few things about what I feel is missing in the report. Ethics, can't find it anywhere. And for me, this is a big issue, because there are lots of good people out there, and sometimes suffering from a reputation, risk of bad reputation because of a few. And the lack of accountability is something that is affecting the whole system. So I would like to see more about how we're going to deal with ethics in the next report. How are we going to deal with corruption? How are we going to make sure that our ethics unit are going to be independent and with a full budget to do their work? How are we going to make sure that iOS is independent and has a consistent budget to do investigation? I think these are things I would like to see more in the next report, and how the fourth technological revolution impacts our work, our deliverables, and our ways of working. It's a new mindset. We should speak more to the young people. They think in a completely different way, and we have to stop being a dinosaur. We have to listen to them. I will conclude. My last word is that reform should not be the business of rich countries, of developed countries. It should be our priority, the developing countries, because we are the ones who need the UN more than anyone else. We also pay assessed contributions. It is also our taxpayers' money, even if it's not a lot. We have to make sure it's well spent. We have to make sure our people are served. We have to make sure there is accountability, there is transparency and efficiency and results and impact. So we should be the one fighting for reform, not the developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your spontaneous remarks. I couldn't agree more, and I believe so many of us here find that this is a very complicated ecosystem, the development world, but fortunately I haven't heard anyone refer to it as a swamp yet. And I think we have a great opportunity to preclude that from happening, thanks to interventions such as yours. And now turning to our next panelist from the donor state perspective again, the Minister for Development Cooperation, Her Excellency Ula Tornes, to whom I would like to pose the following question. What do you perceive as the ask from donors? And what results should be achieved from the reforms from the donors' perspective? Thank you.
First of all, let me thank my colleagues for taking the initiative to organize this very important discussion and very timely debate. Being here at the UN and focusing on the need for reforms of the UN system is absolutely timely. And then I mean, what else can we say just after this very strong intervention by Lebanon? I fully agree with the points made by our colleague. So what is the Danish position in terms of reform? We have expressed our very strong political support to the Secretary General Guterres from the very beginning. And we fully agree with what have been said also by others, that we need a stronger and a more effective and a modernized UN to make sure that we deliver on what people expect us to deliver on. What I think the entire UN system have to adapt and also to cooperate better to support the 2030 agenda. And that is why reforms are so absolutely needed at this very time. I would like to mention two things which has not been mentioned yet, and that is the need to involve private sector. I also believe that the UN has to, in one way or the other, redirect its resources to engage with private business, private sector, to make sure that, or to promote better investment in, for example, climate, to make sure that we achieve the SDGs, and I very much think that the UN needs to take a strong position and be more directly involved also in addressing private sector. And then another issue which have not been mentioned so far, and that is the need to make progress in women and girls' rights. I personally believe that we will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if we do not manage to make sure that girls and women are having the same rights as men. And by the way, we know from different analysis is that we can increase the global GDP, the global GDP with up to 25% if women are having the same rights as men, and by this also getting the opportunity to use their potential also in a economic way. So I think there is a strong need to have an even stronger focus on the empowerment of women, both from a rights perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And we would like to see the reforms also addressing that issue, to make sure that that we're covering this also at country level. I personally believe that we need to tear down the silos in the UN, and by this I also mean the silos at country level. I recently visited food distribution in Ethiopia, and I would have liked to see, for example, access to family planning and education at the same time as we were making food distribution. But this was not the case, and as you were saying, we need to make sure that the humanitarian development nexus is also addressed, and by this we need to cover all, both family planning in humanitarian crisis, to make sure that girls are attending and finishing school also in situations of humanitarian crisis. But just, I mean, to wrap up, we are a strong supporter of the Secretary General's work on reform, and we think this is absolutely necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. We've heard from donors and recipients alike, developed and developing country representative perspectives. And now it's a wonderful opportunity to hear from the Secretariat as well, who has been intimately involved in these innovations. I think of the office involved as the equivalent of Apple computer, and we all look to innovators such as that to present us with the latest version. Relatively soon, the latest iPhone is available. I think people are lining up already, and I know that there can be just as much enthusiasm within this community for the next product, which is coming in December from the Secretariat in repositioning the UN for the development system. And to that point, I'd like to welcome Mr. John Hendra here, who is UN Assistant Secretary General and Senior UN Coordinator within the UN Development System, supporting the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and pose to him the following question: which aspect of the development system reform agenda, from your perspective, is most critical if we are to reposition the UN to meet the challenges ahead? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid it took me a long time to figure out Apple, so I'm not sure that's the best analogy for me. But certainly I would like to start by thanking the three host governments for organizing this event, which I'm participating in my role as the UNDG co-chair of the QCPR coordinating team, working very closely with Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General. I'd also like to thank all the speakers for their comments, because we're at a really fundamental point in terms of the repositioning of the UN development system. And we really appreciate both the strong support, but I think especially your perspectives as member states in terms of where you feel the most important elements are in terms of going forward. As highlighted by Mexico, the 2030 Agenda is clearly the most ambitious anti-poverty, pro-planet agenda ever adopted, and is both a huge opportunity, as you've heard this morning, to really address root causes of persistent poverty, gender discrimination, inequality, and exclusion. But it's also a great challenge, I think, and we need to be very honest, it's a great challenge for all of us in terms of governments, civil society, the private sector, the multilateral system, the UN development system. We all must transform ourselves in terms of being able to work in a much more joined up, a much more integrated manner to really help facilitate these broader cross-society approaches that we need to achieve the SDGs. So hence, I think, as the Secretary General outlined in his June report, this very bold agenda for humanity also needs a very bold, equally bold changes in terms of the UN development system if we're really to be able to maximize our impact. So hence, we're doing this work around three core principles: a reinforcement of national ownership and national leadership, which is fundamental; ensuring we have country contextual responses that really is not a one-size-fits-all, but really is according to circumstances; but also that we really keep our focus always at the country level for delivery, that's real results for people, as the Secretary General also highlighted in terms of the broader reform yesterday. In terms of which part of the reform is most critical, that's a very tough question to answer, because there are several pieces, and also it's seen as an integrated package. But let me quickly highlight three. First, I think, is this substantive change that's inherent in this reform, and this need to really more quickly transition to the 2030 Agenda, and especially its clear focus, as we've heard from everybody, on much more integrated, much more horizontal, much more joint approaches. That means for us as UN, we need to change the way we work to be much more integrated in terms of how we do analysis of root causes, in terms of our policy, normative, capacity development support, in how we help countries to better build resilience, whether from climate change, natural hazards, or risk of conflict, how we approach challenges across development, humanitarian, and peace nexus, in terms of how we support the disaggregation of data, which will be fundamental in terms of ensuring that no one is indeed left behind, and also in terms of our ability to be able to leverage the multi-stakeholder partnerships and just play our role, and sometimes a small role, but a very important role in leverage in terms of success. I think a second critical aspect for me is a focus on leadership, and leadership at all levels, global, regional, and country. I've had the privilege of serving as UN resident coordinator in 3 regions, and for too long, so many of us in the field have felt that reform efforts have often been hindered by lack of progress at headquarters. So here, I think it's really important that the first SDGs report highlighted the need for clear global change in terms of a reinvigorated UNDG, also a new high-level steering committee in terms of fostering greater coherence between humanitarian action and development, but also eventually a reformed chief executives boards under the leadership of the Secretary General. At the regional level, the reforms call also for a clearer complementarity, division of labor in terms of the various parts of the system at the regional level, and also a more clear, cohesive view and policy perspective are key. But also, and I would say most importantly at the country level, the call so far for a new generation of country teams that are much more nimble, much more tailored, but also for impartial, empowered resident coordinators with enhanced authority that can really help lead what has to be then a much more integrated response at the country level. And with this focus on enhanced leadership at the global level, regional, country, also comes a call for much greater accountability, as we've also heard from resident coordinators to the Secretary General, within the system itself, and very importantly from the system to member states in terms of UN system-wide results. And then the third and final crucial aspect for me, again, and this is my personal view, is funding. As applied in the compact, we really need increased political support for greater core resources that really enable the UN system, the UN development system, to really perform its core functions in support of the 2030 agenda. We also really need to address openly the highly fragmented funding of the system, where over 80% of all funding is earmarked, and of that amount that's earmarked, 90% is earmarked to single projects, single donors, single programs. We need much more innovative approaches. We really need to focus on more game-changing pooled funding instruments, and we really need to look at how we can sort of back this reform opportunity with a different way to fund this system that can really help us. Simply put, we need new types of funding to help bring the system together in a more integrated manner rather than pulling it apart. And finally, I've taken note, as there's several colleagues here, in terms of all the additional asks for the next report. I have to tell you, the first one had 38 actions, which I think we're sort of thinking is an awful lot to do, but we really appreciate the kind of the spirit that people member states have said of the areas and the opportunities that they see, and we will certainly take these back to the broader system and to the Deputy Secretary General. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hendra, and thank you for a lively panel discussion that brings us to an opportunity to hear from both a donor and a recipient country. First, we would love to offer the floor for a few moments to Honorable Marie-Claude Bibeau, Minister of International Development, La Francophonie of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. So on behalf of Canada, I wish to thank our three co-hosts for this important event. At a time of evolving global cooperation and interdependence, Canada is committed to supporting the UN Secretary General's ambitious vision and agenda for reform. As he has stated, bold changes to the United Nations development system are needed in order to secure the 2030 agenda's promise of sustainable development, human rights, and peace for our grandchildren. We also firmly see this agenda as building upon other reform efforts, including the Grand Bargain and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. Canada recognizes that the UN is part of a larger ecosystem of institutions and multilateral organizations that addresses global challenges. We need to better understand how this ecosystem works and improve its effectiveness for better results. The Government of Canada knows that focusing on the poorest and most vulnerable, especially on women and girls, is the most effective way to reduce poverty and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In our new Feminist International Assistance Policy, we recognize women and girls as powerful agents of change. They have the ability to transform their families, their societies, and the economy of their countries. We need to do things differently and come up with innovative and creative solutions, including in terms of financing. And we also need to work more collaboratively, focusing on stronger partnership at the global, regional, national, and local levels. This is critical as we work together to meet the ambitious sustainable development goals. In the quest, the UN, with its 193 member states, has a unique and valued role to play in global thought leadership and in mobilizing the global community to action. We also need to put more emphasis on making gender equality part of all our efforts. In the UN's reform efforts, Canada will continue to be an advocate for advancement of gender equality. The following message is one that is worth repeating. The empowerment of women and girls is the most effective way to reduce poverty and build a more inclusive, peaceful, and prosperous world. Together, we must leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And now we offer the floor to the Honorable Matia Kasaija, Minister of Finance, Planning, and Economic Development for Uganda. The floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, Uganda welcomes the convening of this meeting on UN development system reform, and I wish to extend its gratitude to the organizers of this event. The issue of UN management and development reform should be a member states-driven process to generate the necessary consensus on the reforms to be implemented. In the same respect, Uganda extended its appreciation to the Secretary General and his team for the efforts to consult with the member states on the reform process so as to generate necessary consensus that would be critical for supporting the implementation stage of the agreed reforms. As the Secretary General is aware, Uganda continues to play a critical role in hosting one of the UN Service Delivery Centers, the Regional Service Center in Entebbe, and will reaffirm Uganda's commitment to continuing to provide support for the expansion of this regional service center. And in this regard, the government of Uganda has provided 20 acres of land, which provides an opportunity for UN to expand its operations in this region. As you are aware, the center in Entebbe is the only regional service center supporting peacekeeping in Africa. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, refugees. Uganda, we are hosting now over 1 million refugees. It's a big challenge, but we want to use this opportunity to thank the international community. We had recently a forum where many countries participated and states participated and were able to raise something like almost $400 million. But to us, that is it's good, but it's a drop on the ocean. The issue that UN needed to look at, and all of us, is what is the cause, how do we handle the causes of refugees? There are two types of refugees. There are political refugees and economic refugees. If you want to know a political refugee, look at me. I am a former political refugee. So we need to look at this problem as a whole world so that really we can make the globe at peace. Short of that, it shall be just what we call firefighting. Today it is Uganda. Another place will be now maybe the Middle East or something like that. So, Mr. Chairman, we need to look at the causes and try to address the causes of refugee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Now we call upon Secretary of State Patel to provide our closing thoughts.
Well, thank you. Let me just really start by thanking everyone for their outstanding contributions and really thoughtful contributions as well. And I really just want to summarise just a few of the key points that were made. And in particular, the first point is very much on the voice of developing countries. We are here to serve. There is no doubt about that in terms of our role, our rights and responsibilities and the support that we are given to those people who are in such desperate need around the world, whether it's from Lebanon to Uganda, or, parts of the Middle East and other parts of Africa, and even down to Bangladesh, where we see such terrible persecution and tribulations of vulnerable populations. We know that we need to put them first. So on the reform agenda, developing countries have to be an equal partner and an equal voice in this reform agenda, and trying to be the change that we want to see and trying to catalyse that change in particular. There are a couple of other points, because I don't think we've had quite an extensive discussion and views that have been shared. At the heart of reform, there are no doubt some fundamental pillars where we know we need to see basic change, which is obviously efficiency, accountability, transparency, but also value and ethics. They should have an equal footing and an equal status. And I think the way in which many of the contributors addressed that today was absolutely right and the right thing to do. There are two more points that I have, and The next one is very much about the agility and the flexibility of the system that we are seeking to reform, to drive better outcomes. There is no doubt that, we live in a modern world, a modern era, and the system is simply not up to the challenges that we face. 70 years on, technology has moved on, people have moved on, countries have moved on, the agenda is changing. And so looking at the ways in which we can have an integrated approach, which looks not just at cross-agency collaboration, but actually integrating the core skills and the functionality clearly seems to be a point that has come out today. And my final point is actually about money. At the end of the day, we sit here and we all contribute, resources and substantial resources, not just into the multilateral system, but also at a bilateral level as well. I think we should all ask ourselves, through this reform process and the work that we are trying to achieve in moving the system to make it more functional, agile, transparent, how are we effectively using the resources that we have currently within the development and the humanitarian system? Bilaterally, certainly from a UK perspective, we spend huge sums. We do so at a multilateral system too. Multiply that, replicate that, put the multiplier effect on that, the sums are enormous. So how can we address some of the real challenges that we face today and will continue to face going forward by looking at better financing options and making sure that the money is going to where it needs to go, driving that dollar, driving that pound even further to deliver outcomes. And just to say that I really welcome this discussion and thank you to everybody for their contributions.
Thank you, Secretary of State. The Secretary General's report on repositioning the UN development system does what the first of a series should do. It focuses on a few priority issues and it is clear on strategic direction. Today we met for further consultation on detailed solutions. To land its reform directions, we need some heavy lifting on the details and the relationship with other reform tracks underway to take advantage of today's appetite for change and improvement and results from the UN development system. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.